Hey, glad you're joining us today. It's April the 11th, and we're over 100 days into our reading plan, so keep up the good work. Today we're covering 1 Samuel 13 and 14. First off, I'd just like to say a couple things that might be helpful to keep in mind when you're reading through 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. When they were first written, they were only one book, not two. So some scholars may put it because it was too long and it was too much to handle, so it had to be broken up to make it more manageable. But, if that were true, Isaiah and Genesis would have had to have been broken up too, because they contain just as many chapters. Others say it was split to separate the reign of Saul from the reign of David, which makes the most sense to me, so that's what I'm going with. The second thing are the timelines in the book of Samuel. There are many arguments over these timelines and references that lead to confusion. For example, right here in verse 1, Saul lived for 1 year and became king, and then he reigned for 2 years over Israel, and then Saul chose 3,000 men. But back in chapter 10, verse 17, we see that he was already proclaimed king of all Israel, which indicates he was already king and that he hadn't lived 2 more years to become king. So scholars have been debating the differences between these times in the Bible for as long as it's been translated, and they're still debating over today. So the point I want to make is don't let yourself get hung up with all these timeline issues. I believe they are important, but sorting it all out will take much more time and a lot more study. And we never get through our Bible reading plan, and we get totally lost in the process. So just be aware that sometimes you may struggle with this, but focus on what God is teaching you in the scriptures. So back to the first verse, we read that Saul selected 3,000 of the best men he could find in Israel. He put 2,000 around himself and 1,000 around Jonathan, his son. Now Jonathan's the prince and Saul's heir should anything happen to him, so this makes sense. And remember the warnings about having a king that the Lord told him? One of them was, he'll go take all of your young men. Well, that's already happened. Well, in chapter 13 and 14, we have a lot of fighting going on, and it stands to reason that Saul would want protection around he and his son. One important thing to note is most of the soldiers of Israel didn't possess traditional weapons like swords and spears because there weren't any blacksmiths in the land to fashion them. Most of these guys were using farm implements or whatever they could fashion into some sort of weapon from whatever they had. They would not acquire real weapons until some of their enemies were defeated and they could gather up those arms. Our reading today gives us a true picture of Saul's inadequacy as a king. He shows us his impatience and his unwillingness to wait on God. And he's not in touch with what's going on around him. And he makes rash vows and statements that could be catastrophic. And he lets this power go to his head. We see his impatience when he offers up an unauthorized sacrifice instead of waiting for Samuel to arrive. Saul's men are beginning to leave him for fear of the Philistines, and he pulls this stunt just to sway them into staying with him, not because he was inquiring of God. And Samuel confronts him and asks, what have you done? Saul blames it on Samuel. Well, you didn't come when you said you were going to, so I was forced to act myself. I really didn't want to, but something had to be done after all, and I am the king. Well, Samuel's rebuke is a sober one. You have not kept the Lord's commandments. If you had, your kingdom would have lasted forever. Now it will be given to another who seeks after God's heart. Now either Saul did not care, or he didn't get it. I tend to think it was the latter. The next time we see Saul, he's not keeping tabs with what's going on around him. Now, we don't know what led Jonathan to take his armor bearer and go off on a recon mission to the Philistine camp. Maybe he's as impatient as his dad, or maybe he's just fed up with nothing going on and happening, so he goes over to the Philistines to assess their strength. Regardless, he and the armor bearer engage the enemy and kill about 20 Philistines. Now, 2 guys against 20, 10-to-1 odds, that's pretty incredible feat in and of itself. But the result caused the entire Philistine camp to panic, and even some of them turned their swords on each other. Meanwhile, Saul is clueless as to what's going on, but once he's informed, he asks to bring the ark and let's go to battle. There's a little phrase in 14:19 that gives us an indication Saul may have forced this action by his own accord. Tell the priests to withdraw their hand, which seems to indicate that maybe the priests were kind of holding on to the ark and keeping it back. Anyway, Israel's now fully committed into the engagement, and we see a really stupid thing that Saul does. He tells his troops not to eat until they completed defeating the Philistines. And if anyone disobeys him, they'll be put to death. So the longer they fight, the weaker they become and the less effective they become as soldiers. And it's getting harder to finish the job. In fact, they don't. Now, Jonathan, he doesn't hear about this order, and he eats some honey, which brightens his eyes, which is a way of saying that, his strength was restored to him. But since they didn't achieve total victory, Saul determines that someone did not follow his orders, and he needs to be put to death. When he asked who it was, no one in the army would turn in Jonathan. After all, it's his actions that led to the rout of the Philistines. So lots were drawn until Jonathan was selected, and Saul indicates that he's going to go through with his threat, but the people ransom back Jonathan. Lastly, we see after the Philistines have been dealt with that Saul turns his attention to other enemies in Israel, and he had victories and success over them. But nowhere do we see that he followed God. He continued to collect the best fighting men around him and consolidate the power of his kingdom. And he seems to believe that it's all his own doing. We can learn a lot from Saul's mistakes. First of all, rushing ahead of God in our own decisions may not always lead to disaster, but it will prevent us from receiving all that God intended for us. Also, Saul made the same mistake Jephthah made, speaking rash vow. Jephthah had to sacrifice his own daughter, and Saul would have killed his own son had the people not ransomed him. We should really think before we speak. Sometimes it's best if we just keep our mouths closed. And we all tend to be like Saul. When things are going good for us, we often start thinking it was due to our own efforts and not the blessing of God. As we read more about Saul over the next few days, keep in mind, God has already removed the kingdom from him. We'll see that Saul continues to decline, and God will raise another man to take his place. But you'll need to keep reading and following along with us in Set Sail with Grace Harbor. There's a lot more to come. Have a great day, folks, and we'll see you here tomorrow.